Great. Good morning to everyone. My name is Tom Doherty. For those of you who haven't met yet, I'm the Warburg professor here at Simmons. And for those of you who don't know much about the Warburg program here at Simmons, I'm just going to say one or two words because I think it's directly relevant to what we'll be talking about today. 39 years ago, a very generous alumna of Simmons endowed a chair in international studies that brought practitioners in international affairs to Simmons. And over the last 39 years, most have been retired diplomats, and there have been many, many different types of discussions on war and peace and development and security and the future of foreign policy. And on subjects that you would expect. I mean, for example, we'll be having the annual Warburg lecture on April 19th on Ukraine, with a very distinguished speaker and Russia-Ukraine expert. And it'll be in person again, in the first time since COVID. But 39 years ago, I don't think any of us would have envisioned that when we were talking about the most important issues that are affecting international affairs, that it'd be necessarily climate or the environment, but that's very much the case today. And just recently, Stuart Patrick in Foreign Affairs, for example, simply said, the international order is not prepared for climate crisis, and that we need a new form of planetary politics in order to face what really is an existential international threat to all of us. In support of that, Professors Sorabji and Zachary were thinking, what can Simmons do to support today's worldwide teach-in on climate? And they have a very interesting perspective on tying in sustainability with stories. And so when they were kicking around ideas, asked me by chance if I had any ideas of somebody that was doing the same sort of thing. And by great good luck, I did. It's today's speaker, Dan Sherrell, who Professor Sorabji will formally introduce in just one moment, but couldn't have thought of a better person for what they were looking for. And wanted to mention to you just how this came about. Dan, not too many years ago, about 4 years ago, went to Australia as a Fulbright scholar at the time that I was directing the Australian American Fulbright program. Very impressive. You've all seen the TED Talk that he did there in Adelaide. And not to our surprise at all, a great book came out of it that you'll be talking about today. But greater still is reading about the actual achievements that Dan has made on a really huge security vulnerability for all of us, where many times we just throw up our hands and go, it's too big, I don't know what to do. Dan is doing something. And so with that, I just want to say, think about becoming a Fulbrighter yourself someday, or take advantage of other international exchanges. And we'll pass it now to Professor Sorabji. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Ambassador Doherty, and thank you for getting such a wonderful guest to our community. And thank you also to McKinsey and Joe for all the help with the logistics and setting all of this up. I'm so delighted to introduce our speaker, a climate activist, a Fulbright scholar, and an author. Daniel Sherrell is an important voice in the climate movement because he helps us connect to environmental issues on a personal level. In his really well-received book, which I have here, Warmth Coming of Age at the End of Our World, Daniel Sherrell shares the anxiety that young people feel about living with the burden of climate change. He describes the guilt associated with one's actions, one's choices, one's behavior in this environment. And it can be quite overwhelming, but he also gives us hope, both in his writing as well as in his activism efforts, as Ambassador Doherty noted. Daniel Sherrell has been at the forefront, leading so many important efforts in addressing climate change, in addressing social justice, which will have a lasting impact on communities. It's what makes him the perfect speaker for today, the worldwide teaching on climate and justice. here to share his incredible experiences and amazing journey. Please welcome Daniel Sherrell.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that generous introduction, and to Simmons for having me, and to Tom for his now many years of support through 2 different institutions. And I'm excited to talk with you all. I wanted to share a little bit about how I came to the work of organizing in the climate movement, because it really didn't work how I thought it was going to work. And the experience of organizing itself isn't what I thought it would be. And it's both more frustrating and more beautiful than I could have imagined. And I feel like that it's important to encounter that as an undergrad. I grew up in the 1990s, which, if you're familiar with a historian named Francis Fukuyama, was sometimes referred to as the end of history. I was born less than a year after the Berlin Wall fell, Cold War ended, and I was living in a middle-class family in suburban New Jersey, where it was presumed that this decade of neoliberal capitalist prosperity and geopolitical stability would last forever. That's what he meant when he said the end of history. And so in some ways I had a very placid childhood. I played on rec soccer teams, and I took my dog for 2 walks a day. That was my main chore. I'd also take out the trash. I went to school. I was very bookish, I guess, which is not surprising. But there was a weird wrinkle for me, which is that my father worked as a research oceanographer. And for several months every year when I was growing up, he would go down to the Antarctic on an icebreaker, which is kind of ship, collecting samples of the water table, essentially, and understanding how the ecosystems down there work. And we were always really sad to see him go, and always really excited to see him come back, because he'd come back with all these crazy gifts, like a rock he'd pulled up from the bottom of the ocean that was I was like, wow, this is on my bookshelf in my room, and it used to be on the floor of the sea in Antarctica. And he'd come back with these beautiful pictures of calving icebergs and penguins, etc. But he would also always come back with a kind of, I could tell he was anxious, and he would come back with a worried look in his eye. And he would say things like, that's not the same continent I went to 10 years ago. And that was the first time I heard the term global warming, which was a term of art back in the 90s. I was probably 7 or 8. And I had asked him, what do you mean it's not the same continent? And he sort of gently explained to me that the ice was gradually melting, and that whole world slowly under his fingertips, that he was watching it transformed, and had watched it transform over the course of his career. And that this wasn't a problem that was just confined to the Antarctic, but this was, in fact, the entire planet was heating up. And he pulled his punches, but he was like, this is going to affect us. And I remember as a young child feeling like this was an enormously big deal. Looking around to me at authority figures, at teachers, at politicians, at people on TV, and nobody was talking about it. I didn't really see it reflected in society, this concern that I had, that my father had. And so I didn't really know where to do with it. I didn't know how to metabolize this new truth that I'd learned. So I just basically buried it. I put it in a Pandora's box, in the back of my head, and closed the lid, and then went on with my life. And, was kind of a jock in high school, like, still read a lot of books, to the extent that I did any public service work at all. It was like volunteering in my local soup kitchen. But the anxiety never really went away. It was like this ambient pulse that I could feel, but I couldn't really confront, and I couldn't even name sometimes. But I guess it was the anxiety of feeling like this whole placid, stable world that I'd been born into and that I'd been promised implicitly would last in perpetuity was in fact deeply unstable, and that nobody was paying attention to the cracks. So then I went off to college, and I was very lucky to meet a couple of amazing women who had already been radicalized around the climate crisis. One of my dear friends grew up in Nairobi, which in 2009, when I started college, the north of Kenya had been experiencing a millennial drought for 10 years straight. Basically an entire agricultural industry had died there. And she had borne pretty direct witness to that. That was sort of like in some ways it was a liberating experience to me. Like, oh my God, finally some other people who have heard about this, who care about this, who, I don't feel crazy anymore for thinking that this is a really fucking big deal. And together we founded a campaign, one of the first campaigns in the country to make our university divest its endowment holdings from the coal industry and eventually from all fossil fuels. And the logic seemed very obvious to us, which is that if the purpose of a university is to prepare its students for their future, then they can't fund that activity by investing in an industry that fundamentally jeopardizes that future. It defeats the whole purpose of a university. I poured myself into that campaign. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never thought about organizing before. I'd never thought about power before, and how power operates in institutions, and how you can find the levers and build the grassroots muscle you need to pull them. But it was kind of a trial by fire, and we figured it out as we went along. We would do basic things like collecting a ton of petition signatures and recruiting faculty and alumni spokespeople, and all the way up until sitting in outside a meeting of the board of the university to try to force them at least to give us an answer. Why are you still invested in this industry that is destroying our future, that is clawing it from out of our hands? So that was the main thing I did out of schoolwork. And it was a really revelatory experience for me, because I think I had been raised to care about politics, but mostly as a spectator. Politics was a play that I could watch, and I could hope for one ending versus the other, but I was in the audience. I wouldn't, I wasn't going to affect the ending of the play. And what that campaign taught me is actually, I think there's this assumption sometimes that there's somebody driving the ship, that if you go all the way up to the top, there's an adult in the room, and that they're going to figure it out and they're going to make it okay. And what I discovered doing this work in my university, and what I've rediscovered again and again in my activist career, is that there is no adult in the room. There's nobody driving the ship. Democracy is an incredibly hard and involved form of governance. And the only way it works is if everybody on this Zoom, myself, is if you feel like you are the adult in the room, and that you can affect the outcome. And that you sort of need to be, that it's not going to be resolved for you. And I could see that it was immediately obvious to me in my university, 3 of 9 people on the board had direct financial ties to the coal industry. One of them was the president of Bank of America. 2 of them had been involved in a coal export import business. These are all very wealthy people, which is why they were on the board of the university. And it was clear there was just a conflict of interest there. They were never going to vote for our proposal, even if it made moral and financial sense. So all of that was a really important education for me. I got to the end of my college career, and a week before I graduated, we got a hard no from the president that they were not going to divest. And it was brutal. It was just brutal. I'd poured so much of myself into this campaign. And I wasn't shocked at that point, but I was like devastatingly disappointed that this institution would treat its short-term financial and political prerogatives, would place those above as exceeding in importance the value of my future and the future of my peers. And there was a moment there where I could have succumbed to cynicism, and just been like, well, we tried and it's impossible. But by then I was in too deep, and it's not in my nature. I think cynicism and fatalism are not in my nature, and I don't think they're very helpful things when it comes to confronting the climate crisis. Once I had sort of internalized the enormity of what was happening to our planet, and not to our planet, but to us, to our civilization, the enormity of the threat, and how many of the things that I cared about, every person, every place, every principle that I cared about, how many of those things were on the line. It was just clear to me when I graduated, there was no more important work I could do with my life, that this was going to be my life's work. So I dove into it. I moved down to New York City to take a job organizing something that was called the People's Climate March. I don't know, this could be ancient history, but it was back in 2014. We had about 500,000 people in New York. That was a real trial by fire for me, organizing in New York City and recruiting people for this march was a very different ballgame than organizing in a little bubble of my campus. Higher stakes, bigger players. But it was thrilling as well. I remember this feeling of like, my God, I'm part of a social movement. There was this, it was a big effort, that march, and there were many organizations plugged in, and we had a central office right near Grand Central Station in New York City, and, worked for 5 months to pull it off. 500,000 people in the streets, like Ban Ki-moon himself came out to join the march. Like it was an amazing event. Going to that office every day was both immensely stressful because, again, I was just very young and like learning the ropes as I went. Like, what does it take to like convince 500,000 people to spend their Saturday calling on their leaders to act on the climate crisis? It's not always intuitive, actually. For my part, since I was, I wasn't in leadership, I was very much an on-the-ground organizer. There was like a lot of like, recruiting volunteers to recruit volunteers to create a sort of pyramidal structure and then like leaflet every subway station in the city, or like, find 15 community events happening in the next week and like get a speaker on each of those stages, whatever it was. But it was this intoxicating feeling that I was a part of something larger than myself, and that I had somehow escaped the kind of like crushing individualized professionalism that some of my peers had fallen into, people that went to like, whatever, not to cast too much shade, but to cast some shade, like people that went to consulting or investment banking or even went to law school. It was like sort of like, I felt bad for them. Like they'd been trapped in this feeling of like their career was theirs and theirs alone. It was strictly a career. It wasn't necessarily life's work. And you went to work, you worked really hard, you got your paycheck, you went home. And to me, I was like, God, I felt like I'd lucked out. Like I wasn't in a career, I was in a movement, much like the civil rights movement or the women's suffrage movement or the labor movement in the 30s before me. This was like a massive group of people with aligned values that was trying to shape society and steer it in the direction of justice and equity. And that was the other thing I'd kind of learned over the years of this work, that like, you know, I'd come to the issue through a place of real privilege. You know, my father was a research scientist, and, you know, I was introduced to the concept through like, you know, melting icebergs and endangered penguins. But what I came to find out in college and afterwards is that, like, yes, the climate crisis is about that, but it's also about poor people and rich people, and a war by the latter against the former, frankly. What the climate crisis is in human terms is an attempt by the richest industry in the history of the world to do enough political interference work that we sacrifice the lives and livelihoods of millions of poor people to their profit margins, more or less. They would never put it that way. And like, this is, you know, I'm reluctant to assign sort of individual moral responsibility sometimes. I think this is how we've built our society. This is how capitalism has structured the limited liability corporation. The purpose of these fossil fuel companies is the sole legal responsibility of these companies is to maximize value for their shareholders. And they have a very hard time legally taking anything else into account. And so they kind of act like these monomaniacal bulldozers, destroying everything in their path that impedes that goal. And so we've created these enormously dangerous institutions that were built by people and can only be stopped by people. So my orientation to just like what the climate crisis was and what the stakes were really changed. After that big march, very cathartic moment, I went on like a 3-week bike trip after that, because I was like, God damn, I need like a full night's sleep. And then, you know, I was back at it. I was hired by the Sierra Club to be their New York organizer, campaigning to shut down some coal plants and get money allocated for the workers at those plants to transition either into early retirement or into renewable energy careers. After that, I ran a big coalition of labor unions, environmental justice groups, and racial justice groups that, after 2 years of campaigning, successfully passed a big package of climate and equity legislation in New York State, which up until a year ago was the strongest climate legislation in the country on a state level. But a year ago, my current organization, currently the campaigns director at the Climate Jobs National Resource Center, and we work in particular with labor unions, supporting them to win policies that both drastically reduce carbon emissions and create good union jobs. The theory being that the transition to renewable energy is not just what needs to be done to save ourselves, but it could be a lifeline for the labor movement, which has been losing members for 3 decades now, and a renaissance for the American middle class, you know, a huge job creator. And so last year we set up labor-led climate coalitions in 15 states, and our Illinois coalition won a big package of clean energy legislation that was really ambitious and attaches fair labor standards to every clean energy job project above a certain size in the state of Illinois. So it's been a long decade. You know, I've been at this for about a decade now. Long in that, on the one hand, we're not winning, you know, far from it. I think the fossil fuel industry still has like an immense grip on the levers of our democracy. And is coming in, it is imposing itself between the will of the people and our actual policymaking mechanisms. And so I think the last thing I'll share, three things, and I'll do a quick reading, and then I'd love to hear from you all. I think on the one hand, there's this feeling being so close to the political process and really in that inserting myself into those gears as part of a social movement. I mean, it's incredibly ugly. It's incredibly ugly. It looks nothing like the political system I was taught about in high school civics class. You know, I was taught in high school civics class that we live in a democracy. And I don't know if that's entirely true anymore, having been up close and personal. We don't live in an autocracy, certainly, but our values as a public and our very reasonable desire to save ourselves from catastrophe, ecological catastrophe, is being repeatedly and demonstrably impeded by a very wealthy industry with no democratic accountability. So I think on the one hand, it's made me clear-eyed about the fact that, like, the United States, you know, it's all a spectrum, right? Certainly, we live in a more democratic society than, say, Vladimir Putin's Russia. But to say that we live in anything close to a pure democracy, I think is lying to ourselves. And I say that not to inspire cynicism. In fact, in me, it inspires exactly the opposite. The more I've done this work, the more vital I feel it to be. Because when you're up close and personal, what you really understand about politics is it's not some like thing out in the air that's happening on debate stages and in Senate hearings. It's happening to all of us. It's whether you choose to participate in determining what happens. And really, politics at its most basic is the arena by which we decide as a society who lives and who dies, and who gets resources and who does not. And in that, it contains a kind of fundamental brutality, you know, which is hard to deal with every day. It's still hard for me to fathom the kind of dead-eyed cynicism that allows some of these fossil fuel executives to distort our democratic process and point our society towards collapse. I can't imagine it. I really can't imagine it. But the thing that keeps me resilient to that feeling of brutality is approaching the work not out of hatred or spite or frustration, but grounded in the real sense of love I have for the things that I'm trying to preserve and the things that I'm trying to build. A love for my family, a love for my community, a love for the natural world, a deep love for the natural world and its inherent beauty and complexity. And an image I have in my head that I haven't let die of a world where we've met the bare minimum of everybody being allowed to live in dignity and having the resources they need to do that. And so in that way, as brutal as politics is, and it can be brutal, if you do it right, it makes you draw on the deepest wells of love and imagination that you have. And in that way, it's sort of been a gift to be a part of this movement. And I think the last thing I'll say about being part of a social movement is because you're not doing the work alone, if it gets too hard for you 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, you step back, another person steps forward. A social movement is like an organism. And it means you don't have to hold the problem all by yourself. You hold it in community. And that's a very beautiful thing. So that's all I'll share for now. Thanks for listening. And I'm happy, Tom and Niloufar, if you, I can do a short reading, or we can just open it up, whatever you think is right for our agenda. Okay, I'm going to read a passage. Since you all are in college, I'm going to read a passage about me in college, the very beginnings of how I got into this work. It's a few pages. This is at the beginning of the 3rd chapter called Outrage. Though it had formed a distant backdrop to much of my childhood, it wasn't until college that anyone asked me to do anything about the problem. This was in 2009, the beginning of my freshman year at Brown. I remember walking across the quad and being approached by a woman named Emily, who wanted to know if I would make a call to the United Nations. She and a few others were trying to generate as many calls as possible, urging international leaders to take ambitious action at the upcoming Copenhagen Climate Summit. I was only vaguely aware of what the summit was or why it was happening, but I knew Emily through mutual acquaintances. She was tall and trenchant and, on the few occasions we'd met previously, had struck me as someone I wanted to befriend. Behind her, a small fold-out table had been set up and arrayed with pamphlets. Several people, almost all of them women, stood around holding their cell phones to their ears, apparently on hold. "You should come help," Emily said. She had the tongue-in-cheek enthusiasm of someone overcoming her own discomfort, though I sensed too that she really did believe I had a responsibility to help. At the time, it seemed a little preposterous to me that a group of teenagers in Rhode Island could just call the United Nations and make a demand. Still, I felt implicated by the request. I knew in theory that the problem was important, but this importance had always seemed to place it firmly out of my reach, in the hazy firmament of ministers and diplomats. I had somehow never really considered the possibility that I could, and therefore inescapably should, try to intervene myself. Taking a pamphlet from the table, I tapped in the number she gave me and waited to hear a ring. I do not remember who I spoke to that day, nor indeed if I spoke to anyone. Most likely I left an awkward message at the dead end of a long phone tree. What I do remember is feeling a small thrill, the realization, obvious though it had always been, that action was possible, that there were other postures available beyond passive concern. Sometimes people ask me how I got into activism. I never answer with this story, mostly because it wouldn't feel true. I didn't get into anything that day. After I made the call, I went back to my dorm room and read up on the conference in Copenhagen. Over the next year, I took no further action on the problem. What did happen was that Emily and I became friends. By sophomore year, we had formed a housing group with 4 others, and together were assigned a 6-person suite in a large brutalist dorm near the edge of campus. The building was made entirely of concrete, with maze-like hallways it was rumored had been designed to preempt student riots in the 60s. I would come home to Emily lying face up on the dorm's thinly carpeted floor, head propped on whatever was at hand, a backpack, a Nalgene, inhaling a novel at alarming speed. Or she'd be folded into her desk chair, scanning Wikipedia and chewing absently on a lock of hair. Her reading sometimes led her to articles about the problem, which we would discuss with a mixture of hilarity and alarm. The news they contained seemed more than worthy of a riot. Finally, we joked, an excuse to test out the hallways. For my part, there was never any eureka moment, no single event or piece of news that made me resolve from then on to take up the cause. Instead, there was this feeling of slow entrapment. The more I learned about the problem, the more its importance seemed to balloon until I could no longer avoid my sense of implication. As if once I'd fixed it in my gaze, my mind could not be made to forget that it was still there, hovering insistently behind whatever else I was occupied with. In search of an outlet for this muddle of anxiety and obligation, Emily and I joined a campus group that advertised itself as being concerned with the relationship between the problem and development. Each week we'd meet with a professor and a handful of other students, crowding into a small conference room in the university's environmental center. The professor was a kind and disorganized man with an endowed chair in environmental studies and sociology. As a group, our mandate was never quite defined. We had lengthy, generalized discussions about the challenges the problem posed for developing nations and their need for fair representation at the UN climate negotiations. The professor made allusions to our someday drafting white papers that would support certain delegations from the global south, but it was unclear how we would go about doing this or what expertise we'd bring to bear. Sometimes we would Skype a diplomat from the Gambia, a colleague of our professor who spoke hastily about his delegation's research needs, enumerating various topics we could barely understand. During these calls, I'd glance across the table at Emily, who'd invariably be sunk down in her chair, embarrassed that all we had to offer this learned, harried-seeming man was a room full of bewildered undergrads. The fact that any national delegation would be taking the time to consult our haphazard little group seemed to indicate something very scary about the world's broader level of preparedness. The last 20 minutes of every meeting would be taken up with a collection of everyone's lunch order for the following week's session. Going around the table, each of us would name our choice of meat or cheese, our preference for either a baguette or a panini. The professor would transcribe each order word for word in his notebook, and at the next session, our lunches would be there waiting for us, delivered ahead of time by a local bakery. Emily started calling it the Apocalypse Sandwich Club. After a few months, we'd both stopped attending. By then, though, there was no turning away. The problem had insinuated itself into our friendship, lending it the succor and structure of a shared concern. We still mostly talked about other things, our classes, our classmates, but the problem was like a premise we'd both watched each other internalize. We understood and understood each other to understand that it was deadly serious. And despite our gallows humor, we were people who took serious things seriously. It would have ruined our self-concept, I think, to have ignored an apocalypse in the making. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was wonderful, challenging, difficult, and above all, deeply personal. And I think probably all of those things are very linked. I don't want to take any time away from questions because I think there's so much there that we can dig into. But I do want to take a couple seconds here just to thank Joe and Mackenzie again for all their support putting this together. And also Professor Sarabji and Ambassador Doherty. I know you put a ton of work into this talk and it's such a great talk. So thank you so much for that as well. But with that, I really want to just open it up to the students and anybody else in the audience to ask some questions to Dan. If you could raise your hands in the chat, Professor Sarabji and I will call out the next question and Joe will unmute you so you can ask Dan your question. So it looks like Kiki has a question, so let's start out there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I just have a question, a general one. How can we get ourselves and others involved with activism like this, and where do we even begin?
It's a big question and kind of the critical one. I would name two places. First, I'll just make this as concrete as possible. Some of you may have heard of an organization called the Sunrise Movement. It's a youth climate organization that does amazing, love-motivated work that is not at all, doesn't pull any punches politically. And they're very effective. And I'm positive there is a Sunrise Boston chapter that you could get involved in tomorrow, and it's doing good work. The other place I might start is, I think one place that I didn't look to a lot as a young person wanting to get involved in change making was electoral politics. I just thought they're all kind of the same and horrible. But actually that's not true. It turns out it really does matter who holds elected office. And so if you are in a district where, if you ever find yourself in or near a place where it's a tight race between a Democrat and a Republican, or it's a tight race between a Democrat who accepts donations from the fossil fuel industry and a Democrat who does not, or a Democrat who supports the Green New Deal and a Democrat who does not explicitly, getting involved in those races is both really important and a really good introduction to what organizing is like. And honestly, if you just keep showing up for a campaign, especially if it's a campaign at the local level, like for Boston City Council, for example, or I know you guys just elected an amazing new mayor, but state legislators, state senate, etc. Even as a 19-year-old, if you just keep showing up and you're competent, like they're gonna give you responsibility, you know, because a lot of these campaigns are just like cash strapped and building the plane as they fly it. So that's those are two concrete ways to get involved. But the main thing in anything you do is like really figuring out, okay, how much time can I devote to this? Making sure you can devote that amount of time relatively sustainably, and then just continuing to show up. You'll be surprised at how quickly you get involved.
Amanda, do you have a question?
Yeah, hi. So my question was, which climate issue should we be focusing on the most right now, and what steps can we take towards addressing it?
Yeah. To my mind, there's a satisfying and an unsatisfying answer to that question. The satisfying answer is that I think the most important climate issue right now in the United States is that the Biden administration and Congress pass a $500 billion climate bill that has been on a knife's edge in Congress for months now. Some people might have heard about the bill called Build Back Better, or something called the Reconciliation Bill. The Democrats, as usual, have messaged this terribly in a way that nobody understands. But like actually, the most important climate legislation in US history is Will Live or Die in the next, basically before July. And today there is a giant nationwide mobilization launching to try to give the political pressure and cover to get that across the finish line. April 23rd, the day after Earth Day, there's going to be a big flagship rally in DC that I'd encourage all of you guys to make plans to come to, and also distributed actions all across the country, possibly some in Massachusetts if you can't make it to DC. Getting that bill across the finish line in the next few months before the midterm elections is vitally important. The unsatisfying answer to that is that there's so many facets to the climate issue, and they're all a piece of the puzzle. Whether it's sustainable agriculture or, renewable energy technology and development, or locking yourself to fossil fuel infrastructure so it can't get built, or doing things like social work or nursing or any sort of low carbon career that increases societal resilience. All of that is climate work. All of it is connected. And so I would say it's less about, I think the most important thing is finding the thing that you're passionate about and that you can do and that you can be effective in from where you're standing, and going hard on that, because there are a lot of different pieces to this puzzle. I see a question in the chat. Should I address that one? How did I make the decision to switch from activism work in the States to applying for Fulbright? To be honest, it was in some ways an autotherapeutic decision. I'd been at that point doing climate activism work for like 6 or 7 years. And I could feel this like knot of thought and feeling sort of winding itself tighter in my chest every day I went to work to take on this incredibly weighty issue. But I didn't actually have time to unravel that knot because I was just in the trenches of conference calls and emails all day, doing the work. And I could sense that if I didn't step back to figure out a way to do some emotional processing around just how hard this all was, then something in me was maybe going to break, and I wouldn't be able to keep doing this work for the rest of my life. And so the Fulbright was a very premeditated way for me to step back and do some processing that would reorient myself and reground myself in the work. And writing is one of my primary modes of processing. And I was just really grateful to the Fulbright program for giving me that opportunity. And yes, then there's a chapter towards the end of the book where I talk about, I had an experience while in Australia. I was lucky enough, my host professor, he's an amazing guy. He's like a professor of postmodern theory, but he also, his like academic project is basically to create a conversation between Aboriginal cosmologies and like fancy French postmodern theory, which sounds kind of gimmicky, but actually there's a lot that's very fruitful. And he's a really smart and compassionate man. And he had a longstanding relationship with an Aboriginal mob. Mob is the term of art in Australia. You say them mob over there. About any large group of people. An Australian mob up in the northwest of Australia in this remote region called the Kimberley. And he'd go every year and walk their ancestral songline. And a songline is a kind of Aboriginal devotional practice where you walk a certain path across a landscape. It can take 3 hours, it can take 3 weeks. And you tell stories as you go about that landscape. Oral histories that are passed down from generation to generation about where the land came from and where it's going. It's an incredible mixture of like devotional practice and art form and wilderness trek. That is a kind of a way that the profound relationship to landscape gets renewed cyclically. And I was lucky enough to go live with him out in the Kimberley in the bush camp of this Aboriginal mob for a month, and then walk their traditional songline, which took 9 days of barefoot walking across a very remote stretch of coastline in the northwest of Australia. There's a lot to say about that experience. It was intensely meaningful, and I learned so much. But maybe most important for me was what it felt like to really embed myself briefly in a community that really did not see the boundaries of society stopping with humans. That society, what they considered to be society, really did extend to the rocks and the ocean and the hermit crabs and the bees in the bark, in the tree bark, and the hawk flying over above. That all of those things were connected in sort of like mundane networks of responsibility and guilt and annoyance and love and like all the things that you think about, the emotions you think about connecting you and your friends, like actually, like in a very real way, those emotions were present also with the non-human world. And that's still a place, having grown up in suburban New Jersey at the end of history, like I have trouble thinking those thoughts, just because of the way my brain was shaped by the culture I was raised in. But it was amazing to learn from that, even from a short period of time.
Kat, you've been waiting a while. Looks like you have a
Hi.
question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, just making sure. Okay, my question is, who should bear the burden of responsibility that comes from climate change? And how can you use it to make a productive change without it like weighing on you too much emotionally?
The burden. I guess that question can be interpreted in a bunch of ways. Who should bear the moral burden? I think are the people who have profited enormously from getting us into this mess, which is largely the fossil fuel industry and the politicians they've purchased to do their bidding. On a wider scale, I also think that like the global north should bear the responsibility because, fossil fuels have sustained, a comfortable lifestyle for us for about a century. But that has come at the expense of immense potential suffering in the global south, especially, but across the world. And so I think on a moral level, climate reparations are long overdue, a big transference of wealth from the global north to the global south to help them deal with the problem that we created and that they're having to deal with first and worst. And then there's the broader thing of like, who should bear the burden of climate change? I mean, at the end of the day, regardless of who's morally responsible, it is all of us that are going to need to step up and do our part to fix this thing. That's not even a moral judgment, that's just a practical judgment. If highly educated people in the global north, such as yourselves, don't see themselves as deeply responsible and implicated, then I don't think we're gonna, I don't know, I have a hard time seeing us turning around the ship. So, yeah, there's a narrow answer and a broad answer to that question, but I think it's us. How do you do it without letting it crush you? I mean, I wrote a whole book about it, man. That's like that's the real name of that's the $1 million question. It's really hard, but I think be ambitious about your limits, but also realistic about your limits. And then also, I mean, this is a thing that I struggle with daily. It's like this tension between enjoying to the fullest this one life I've been given and enacting my responsibility to allow others to do the same. And those things sometimes feel in tension. And I think I just try to sit with that dynamic equilibrium and not let either side completely dominate the other. Like, I'm not going to just sink into hedonism and like my own little private life where I get to go on vacation and, maybe be stressed about my newsfeed, but not really engage. I'm never going to do that. But likewise, I'm never going to work 12-hour days forever until I kill myself. It's like, I just don't want to live that way. And I'm not willing to sacrifice, the other things that I find beautiful about being alive. And it's not, you'd be surprised to know, sitting on Zoom all day.
Maria Carmona has.
Hi, so basically my question is, how do you decipher genuine activism from performative activism, especially when you see these messages on social media? And how could somebody move away from performative activism and start to engage in genuine activism and genuine discussions?
That's such a good question, Maria. That's such a good question. I guess I'll point you to one telltale sign, I think, that I use to distinguish between genuine activism and not. I'm a conscientious objector for most of social media. It just makes me stressed out and I don't want to spend my time on it. When I do go on Twitter and whatever, lurk there and see the way that political views get expressed, I don't know. It often seems like, regardless of the merit of the view itself, the reason it's being expressed seems to be more about clout and sort of I'm right, you're wrong, than it does about actually building power in order to enact policies to make people's lives better. So I guess a more articulate way of saying that is that I would distinguish between two forms of politics: what I'd call prefigurative politics and what I'd call strategic politics. Prefigurative politics isn't really concerned with changing outcomes. It's concerned with stating the right beliefs, being passively on the right side of history. But the attitude is almost fatalistic, this whole system is screwed and the ship's going down. I can't or won't do anything to stop that, but at least I'm going to be shouting at the top of my lungs the right talking points as the ship goes down. that to me is not activism. It's like a way of, it's a kind of practice of moral hygiene, just making sure that like your little tiny bubble is purified. I think real activism is serious about building power, and building power, I should add, this is another telltale sign, means joining in coalition with people that you don't agree with 100%. I think there's a lot of activism on social media that basically is like, if you don't agree with me on these 15 points, like don't even talk to me. And that is an incredibly effective way to ensure that progressives never build enough power to do anything. We'll just all be right in our own little bubbles and ineffective, and the fossil fuel industry is going to bulldoze us, you know? So in my work, you know, I'm often in contact with building trades unions, for example, whose leadership is mostly knows what's up, but whose membership, these are like union pipe fitters, plumbers, sheet metal workers, steel workers, you know, in Wisconsin or in Texas. Most of them voted for Trump, you know? These are like mostly non-college educated white people. And they hold some beliefs that I find to be abhorrent. I mean, their support for Trump is morally abhorrent. I also know that in a lot of these states, these guys want to build a lot of clean energy because it means jobs for them and their family. And even though I think their views are abhorrent, I can see at least a common humanity in them wanting to make a decent living for their family and like be able to take a week of vacation every day, every year. Every day would be a lot. And so it's finding, I think real activism finds the center of the Venn diagram and uses that to build power and build coalitions. I think fake activism is like, fake activism is more preoccupied with like a kind of moral purity tests and grandstanding that is actually not about improving anybody's life, but is about ensuring you yourself are perceived to be right and pure. And that's all very well and good for you. But if we're serious about improving the lives of working people, which is what my work is about, then that's not a very strategic way to go about it.
So I think I saw Olga's hand go up, and then there's also a question in the chat as well. So maybe we could, Olga, you can go first, and then we'll go to the chat question.
Okay, my question is, do you think we can focus on environmental justice and economic justice at the same time? And is there a balance between the two?
That's a great question. I actually think we have to focus on them at the same time because I think they're inseparable. I think it's not surprising. It's not a coincidence that in places where in the United States and around the world where you see massive levels of economic inequality, you also see massive levels of environmental injustice, which is to say, if power is distributed way disproportionately in society, that means that a very few people are reaping all the resources for themselves, and a very many people are being screwed over, basically, again and again. And I think in this country, there's a long history of poor communities, mostly Black and brown communities, being used as essentially sacrifice zones for capitalism. You know, like, oh, we can put our giant coal plant there. Yeah, all these kids are going to get asthma, but what political power do they have? You know, that's like literally the calculus of some of these corporations. What are they going to do about it? And simultaneously, those industries are by and large pretty exploitative of workers, especially low-income workers. So honestly, the work I'm doing right now, which is to like, we need to build out the renewable energy economy as fast and as big as possible, and also make sure those are union jobs, is a way to enact climate justice and economic justice at the same time. And I think any climate solution that relies on further impoverishing already impoverished people is going to fail simply because it won't have democratic support, and it'll, human suffering is a very quick conduit to societal breakdown, which is the thing we're trying to avoid with the climate crisis. So I think those two things are inseparable, and that real climate activism is not just about reducing parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but it is about redressing the immense inequalities in wealth and resources that have gotten us into this problem in the first place, that are both the symptom and the cause of this problem. And I probably have time for one more question, if that's all right.
There was a question in the chat.
Yeah. How do you convince people to work together considering the increasing polarization? Yeah. Yeah. That's a doozy of a question. I don't have the answer to that question. I don't have the answer to that question. I think that the Republican Party has basically turned into, they are increasingly explicit about being opposed to multiracial democracy, just as an electoral project. I mean, they tried to cancel 8 million votes in the last election, or at least Trump did, and many of his henchmen. And it's a scary thing. It's a scary situation we're in. And I don't know how to bring them back from the brink. The one sliver of hope I feel is that when it comes to being distrusting of giant corporations, including the fossil fuel industry, those feelings are very bipartisan. The MAGA base identifies big corporations as their enemy. The left and progressives identify big corporations as their enemy. And I think we're both kind of right on that. Just in that we've created these institutions that have no democratic accountability, but have massive impacts on everybody's life. And that is an inherently unsustainable situation. So I sometimes dream about like the perfect presidential candidate coming and like doing a kind of reorientation in politics to unite those two anti-corporate sentiments. It hasn't happened yet, partially because we don't have campaign finance reform, and both parties in our country are somewhat beholden to big corporations. Yeah, so I guess I do think getting money out of politics is one part of striking at the root of that problem, but I don't claim to have the full answer. Thank you.
Thank you. We just want to thank you so much, Dan. As you can see from the chat, everybody is we're so taken by what you've shared with us today. Thank you so much. And there was a question in the chat about your book. It's called Warmth: Coming of Age at the End of Our World. So this is the book. Thank you again so much.
Thank you all for having me. This was a real pleasure. Great questions. Bye now.
Bye.